Hi everybody, Roxanne Steed here. It's good to see you. I've got a quick demo on scribble drawing. I tell you, I've had so many people tell me that they're afraid to take on even trying watercolor or drawing because they can't draw a straight line. Well, in this case, it doesn't matter because straight lines aren't necessary in this. Excuse me. So I want to show you how to make a wonderful drawing and actually an ink and wash type of sketchbook page that would be a wonderful addition to your sketchbook skills. And you'll have some pretty beefed up things, even if you're just in your backyard, like it may happen to be this summer. So anyway, let me change the camera down to our work surface and let's begin. Okay, so in our class packet, I had, excuse me, emailed out a good stack of reference photos for us to use of some simple evergreens at our local park. It was March here in Connecticut when I took these, so even though it was relatively warm that day, there's, it's still late winter. So I've got some interesting photos of this time of year. And what I'm going to share with you are some tips to how to make some interesting textures. This is actually a post, some interesting rusted bolts and wires and rock and lichen. And anyway, I'm going to talk about the many things that you can do with ink pens. So the different kinds of ink pens that I've been using, for years I've been using the Pigma Microns made by Sakura. And lately, my students have been complaining that these seem to run out of ink really fast. I do know the rougher the surface of the paper, it will eat through the nibs. They're just like a little tiny felt tip nib. I don't know if you can see that against the white of the pan. But anyway, they have tiny nibs and they make really nice fine lines. So they're great for drawing all kinds of things. Another brand that I have been testing out lately is the Molotow brand. And I'll list these in my YouTube entry, so you'll be able to find those. And also, they come in different nib widths, just like the Microns do. And they're quite lovely. You know, they have that nice fine tip and make some beautiful lines. And you want to make sure that in this instance, since we're going to be running watercolor over it, you want to make sure that it says that they are permanent indelible ink so that they won't run. Another example of some things that I've been using are fountain pens. So I have a couple of Lamy Safari fountain pens that have permanent document ink, and it's really nice. So I have one in black and one that I have filled with brown ink. And the pens are pretty, they write really lovely. I used to be kind of afraid of using fountain pens, but I tell you what, I really, really like these. In fact, I have kind of begun using these. Well, not kind of, I really love these way more than I do even the Microns and the Molotows, which I used to love a lot. So, and these are still great pens. And they are a great place to start if you're still kind of leery about jumping in with a fountain pen. So I'll demo a little bit with the Molotow and with the fountain pens today. So first thing I want to talk about is the different kinds of lines that you can make. And there's so many wonderful things that you can do, and it's pretty easy. So like I've got here on my demo page, you can make all kinds of little hash marks. So these are great ways of shading in areas. You can do a parallel crosshatch. So they're, running opposite each other. If you've got a rounded object, you can do a contoured crosshatching. So this is the Micron pen, and I can see that it is starting to run out of ink a little bit, and it may be one that I've had for a while. I'm going to switch over to the Molotow. So another kind is just scribbly crosshatch. So if you've got some random things and that need a lot of a textural look, that's a good way to fill in and darken some areas. Another way that you can use your ink marks is just to make stippling, which is just making a little random series of dots. I don't know if you can see that. Let's get this closer up under the camera. And so I'm making a lot of dots, and the farther apart you make them, the more pale they are. If you start to add some more in and make them more dense, you're going to darken that area. So you can darken certain curves. So this is whether you're making flowers or tree bark or anything really. You can see how that has darkened that one side of that little sphere. And indeed, you can make little flower things. Let's see, another thing that's fun with these pens, and they just really lend themselves to giving your watercolor a lot more definition. So in a sketchbook, it's great fun. Tree bark, you can fill in the cracks and divots that are in the depths of trees. Wavy lines are great for wood blocks, so you can show the wood grain or feathers, and you can kind of do them stylized or even a little more realistic. This was a pheasant feather that I had from ages ago, and you can just do little squiggly lines for some of the, you can see how this kind of looked. For some of the areas, you've got some of these spotted areas and then some more of the lines, and it's a fun little way just to represent those soft parts of feathers. And then another thing that's fun to do for wavy lines is hair. Just think of all the tresses that you could define with these stacked parallel curvy lines. But today we're going to be talking about scribble lines. And so this is especially for you if you're one who thinks, I can't draw a straight line, so how am I going to do this? So what I do, let's go back to our reference photo. Get that handy. And I'm going to choose, let's see, I do want to talk about some of the reference photos. So when you're looking at a photo, these are all places that I've been and I've hiked, and I've actually painted on location at some of these. And for you painters that have a lot, have some experience under your belt, and it's not your first paint out, you know that sometimes the things that you see in a photo don't give you a real sense of the place that you were at that day. Where in photos you can, or in sketches in your sketchbook, you can add a lot of, more feeling about a place. So for example, this sketchbook page is actually this tree. And I used this photo as a jumping off point. This is a place that I hike very frequently, and it's got some interesting trees. This is actually someone's backyard that backs up to this park, but the view across the marsh is really nice. So I wanted to keep that distant tree line really soft. And I thought the fence was interesting, but I wanted to break up this place, and I wanted to leave an opening in here. This little shed didn't really support anything that I was, that was important to me in the sketch, so I left it out, and I also omitted that tree. I did leave in that shrub, but mainly this sketch was just a quick sketch of this tree because I just found it had a very interesting shape. And it is a tree that I do remember because about last summer there was a humongous hornet's nest in there that it was over a foot big, and it was always kind of scary walking by there because, you know, if that thing had fallen on anyone, it could be trouble. So here's an example of a sketch where I took a reference photo that I didn't think was, I mean, I took the photo because I liked the shape of these trees and I liked where it overlapped the water and I liked the tall grasses. I thought this house on the distant bank was really fascinating, but if you paint from a photo like this, you've got this dead end that hits right against the edge of your page, and it's just not a good composition. So what I wanted to do, and what I actually did, was I took this photo and just moved some of these trees so that I had an interesting balance of kind of like this, I think they call it steel yard. It's almost like a teeter-totter balance. So you've got heavily weighted over here, but you've got the weight of this, you know, focal point right here. And I wanted to move this so this would be a more interesting focal point than where it is in this photograph. And then I could still have the overlapping the water. So this was, for a sketchbook page, this was a lot of fun. But I like this scribble drawing because it does add a lot of texture to your trees. Let's see if we can see that close up. It's it has just some lovely dimension to it. So we're gonna work from, let's see, I think I do have one more photo that I thought was pretty interesting. Yeah, I like this one with the rock wall. So I think I might handle, let's do a sketch of this tree with the stone wall, those big rocks. And we'll show a way of how you can, what you can do with that. So let's see if I can get my reference photo over here so that I can see it. And then you can see my workspace. And we'll get my paint pan here for momentarily. So what I do when I'm first laying out my ink drawing, and this is whether I'm working from a photograph or whether I'm outside, and I see there's a big object that I want to make sure it's placed on my page, I figure out where the top is and where the bottom is. Where do I want to place them? And so it doesn't have to be the same size as what I'm seeing in life, because in life, if I'm out on location, that tree is going to be enormous. And how do I place it on my page to show what I want to see? So I'm going to pick a top point where I want this top to start. And I'm going to pick a bottom point where I want that tree to end. And in this case, I'm going to include a rock wall. So I've determined how much space do I want to dedicate to this rock wall. So I'm just kind of making pinpoints. I like this place where the rock has tumbled down and there's almost an opening. I think I'm going to actually make an opening and put that in there. Now, composition-wise, this is your main subject. This house back here in the background, it doesn't add anything to this design or this sense of place for me. So I'm just going to be focusing on this tree today. But I do like this little tumble within the wall. So I think what I might do is place this somewhere so that it would make an interesting focal point that would lead into the tree. So I'm going to determine how tall I want this. So we've kind of made marks on here, and then I'm going to make marks for how wide that I think I want it. So, and this is just kind of eyeballing to see how far do I want to come with some of these? And then I'm going to start the scribble. And so it's just, I'm going to follow these shapes just kind of randomly down this tree. This one kind of sticks up a little. So I am not copying this or trying to replicate it exactly. I'm using it as a jumping off point. That's it. It's only to give me a sense of feel. When I go out to paint on location, I am not making botanical scientific drawings. I am making a record of the emotions that I felt that day, a sense of place. So I'm not going for rigid detail. I'm just going for a general sense of what I'm seeing. So again, this can go pretty quickly. I mean, you can kind of go slow and make little slow rambling circles, but you can also kind of get a little heavier handed and a little quicker. And one thing that I think you're going to find, I think you'll notice, is that sometimes it is kind of harder than you would think to be random. I think as humans, we're kind of wired for symmetry, the symmetry and balance. And so it's, trying to be random is kind of harder than we initially think. So I'm going to kind of pay attention to the fact that there's some air holes in here. So I'm going to leave some little gaps in my drawing because there's some really nice gaps in here. I think air hole, I call them air holes, the space between all the limbs. I think that adds a really lovely touch. So, sometimes when you get going, it's easy to get carried away. So leave some things that look sort of like air holes. If you kind of forget, then just as long as your scribbles are not too filled in at this point, we can remedy that. So again, I'm trying not to make too many swirly, swirly, swirly swirls that are just straight, but actually do some random back and forth and up and down. If it helps you to kind of just make this big trunk all the way down, just kind of do a rambling trunk. That way you kind of know, maybe some of the direction that you're going. But I'm going to continue these big boughs or branches that kind of come out. And you'll notice there's some areas where it's really dark where it's really heavily shadowed because the needles on the tree are pretty thick foliage. So we're going to keep going like that. And again, you can do it as quickly or as slowly as you need. I'm going to go kind of big here, big scribbles to kind of spread out the space because they're bigger branches as they go down the tree. These kind of slope down and then the ends sort of flare upward just a bit. So I'm going to try to capture that direction in this. Have a little bit of downward slope and then a little bit of tipping up at the end. Trying to consider where there might be some little air holes between the branches. So again, just keep it going and do sort of a random scribbles. It's actually pretty fun. So what you're doing is you're describing the mass of this tree. So you're not going linear. Linear is when you just draw with lines. So here you're actually describing the mass or this volume, the fullness of this tree. So what we're going to do next, now that we've gotten kind of this tree shape, basic shapes, we're going to start looking for where is it darker. Let's see if I can tilt this so you can have a better look at this photograph. So there are some areas within the tree they appear darker because it's so thick that the light's not getting through. So we're going to darken up some of these areas just by going over those darker areas a second time. And we'll continue that down the tree. I'm going to darken up that trunk a little bit. Maybe indicate some little side branches. There's some darkness underneath there. And big dense area right in here. And also a dense area right in here. Then I'm going to darken up the trunk some more with the on the parts that are within the tree. It's not so dense afterwards. I think I actually took my limbs down a little bit further than I had intended, so maybe I can drop my wall down a little bit. Maybe I'll do that. Darken up some of these spots that are dense. So these lines, while you're not exactly coloring things in, you're just adding more, the scribbles that you're adding add a little bit of density to that, which makes it appear a little bit darker. So you're gathering the shape. So the thing that's nice about this is that this is a fun way to sketch if you're out hiking and you want to keep your pack really light. All you need is a pen, one brush, and some paint, and you can hike for a long way. When you keep your load really light, you can get out to some more interesting views than if you were carrying, say, 50 pounds of oil paint and a big heavy easel and all that kind of gear. It can be done, but it's going to be a lot more energy that you use up if you're carrying a bigger load. So I have found it in the last many years, the more that I want to lighten my load, the more I love my watercolor paints. Because I have painted in all mediums, oils, painted in oils for, gosh, 20-something years. And I still do occasionally, but I really have fallen in love with the watercolors because I like traveling light. So we have brought that out to that. So that gives it a bit of density. And now we're going to focus on the rocks. I'm just going to figure out where I want the top of this to go. And you can see from the photo, this is an old New England wall. They're just stacked in the field where the farmer wanted to clear his fields. This was an old farm that's been made into a state park, regional park kind of place. So I'm going to show the randomness of these stones. Some go high, some go low. When they go low, you go high. Love that saying. So anyway, we're going to just give a sense of where these are going to be. This is, so I'm just capturing the top of this wall. I want this little tumble down place to be here. So these rocks are going to be a little bit lower. And then maybe leave a little space here, an opening where they've been rolled out, rolled away. Then we're going to come under here. So we're going to keep those rocks. You know, they're not just a bunch of circles. They have angles and cracks and divots. And even though some of them can be chipped and laid pretty smooth, these are just pulled out of the ground and shoved up into a wall shape. So some walls in New England you'll see are really well formed, and some are just old and stacked by the farmer, and they're quite beautiful too. So, and again, I'm not copying each stone verbatim. I'm just using my photograph as a jumping off point. And so I'm going to be laying in some of these. And remember at the bottom, you've got all this brushy stuff that's kind of coming up over the edge. So you can indicate some of that with some, you know, almost scribbly lines. So they're not really straight lines. They're just almost scribbly lines. There's some shadow areas in between these rocks, which make it, you know, these ink pens do really well at showing these shadow forms in between these huge stones. So again, I'm just going to try to use this as examples of how I might form some stone. Because if I were to try to copy them all exactly how they are, one, you're going to run out of daylight if you're out on location. So you want to keep your sketching skills pretty nimble, because the light changes so quickly when you're out on location, and the weather can change. There could be a bear in the woods, or a coyote, or some kind of human weirdo that you really don't want to be around. That's probably a bad example to bring up, but the thing that you really don't want to dilly-dally around with is the fact that the light changes so quickly when you're outside. So making the, you know, quick little sketches just to give you some ideas of what's out there. There's some tall grasses and reeds and things. That will give you a nice idea of what you have been looking at that day. So now I'm going to just indicate like a far horizon line. That's the back edge of that field that comes behind that tree. And then there's this distant tree line. So I look at the photo and I see that, okay, that distant tree line comes probably below the top third of that tree. And the edge of that field is about the top third. So that's one of the reasons I liked that color banding there. I think it's a nice division of space. So I'm going to very faintly indicate that far tree line. And if you wanted to, you could, in fact, what's interesting, I'm looking at this space in this photo. The far tree line actually comes there. I'm going to ink in a line right here. It looks like it's here initially, because this is where this one type of yellow-brown reeds and then these more reddish-brown reeds are growing. And then that edge of that field is actually a little farther apart. So I'm going to put another little band here and just softly, lightly indicate that with my pen. You can lay in ink marks if you want to. I know some artists who will indicate, you know, the background trees with a series of lines like this. Sometimes I'll do that. I'll do that in this case, but a lot of times I'll just leave the background trees light, because I do want to have some contrast between this main tree and what's going on in the background. So now that you've done that, this page could stand alone on just that. No more would be required. This would give you a nice sense of place. Let's put in a few more rocks in here. So this would give you a nice sense of place, kind of give you a feel for the day of this place that you hiked or where you walk, or maybe it's your backyard. So the thing that I'm going to do first, now we're ready to paint. Let's get this reference. I'm going to move this where I can see it. Every once in a while, I'll bring it in to kind of show what I'm talking about. I'm going to get this set up where you can see the paint mixing going on and the drawing as well. So let's squirt down the paints. And in this sky, we've got it's a really nice bright day. So your sky, if you squint with your eyes, squint down, and when you squint, whether you're outside or even looking at a photo, it takes away the detail so that all you see are the darks and the lights. So it helps you see where, you have your highest area of contrast, which is kind of in this area, and your sky too. But your sky usually is your lightest value. So we're going to mix up a nice batch of blue, and I want to get a big enough puddle so that I can cover this sky all at once. And I haven't wet my paper first, as I'm just going to go in with my brush fully loaded. And I always have a little scrap paper beside me just to make sure that I've got the color that I want. So on my left, because I'm right-handed, so I'm going to paint with my right hand, have my paints on my right hand, so I can go from my water, which is here, so I have my water here, my paints here, and then going to my picture, and then my paper towel in my left hand. And I like the Viva paper towels. I wish I owned stock in them, but I don't. But I love them because they're really smooth. They don't leave imprint marks on your painting. So let's get the sky going. Because I usually I start with the top and go down most of the time. So I'm going to get a pretty big puddle, check my color. And I think I accidentally hit a touch of purple in my box. Now, as I come down, I'm going to change blues. I'm going to add a little bit of cobalt blue. I started out with ultramarine. And as I come down the sky, I'm just going to keep on going. And you can paint over your inked in tree because the ink is going to stay put, and you don't have to worry about it going anywhere. And when this is dry, then we can paint our tree stuff over that. So now the paper that I'm working on it's 100% cotton, but it's also, it's not a really super heavy paper, but I like it because it's all cotton, and it'll say, if your paper's all cotton, it'll say 100% cotton. This is the Strathmore Visual Journal. It's for mixed media. The one that is labeled watercolor is not all cotton, so pay attention to it. Now, because cotton is king. This is 90-pound paper, so it's a little bit thinner than the 140-pound paper that they usually make watercolor out of. But for a sketchbook page where you can practice a lot, you get a lot of bang for your buck with this book. It's 9 by 12, and I think it used to be maybe about 14 or 15 bucks. And if you get it on, at Michael's or AC Moore with a coupon, you could a lot of times get them half price or 40% off. So it's you can get a lot of mileage out of this, and you should have no qualms about whipping through lots of sketchbook practice with a book like this. And what I find, after your paper dries and your book is closed up, those sheets do smooth out again. So the next thing I'm going to do is this distant tree line, and I'm going to go in with sort of a grayish color, a grayish brownish color. Keep these paints wet. I'm in the house and the heat's still on, so paints will dry up. Now you'll notice your paint will dry at various rates depending on what the weather is. Let's see, so I want to warm that up a little bit. Warm up this brown and make it sort of a rosy, what I call a rosy gray. So let's bring that to our background. And again, I'm going to keep this fairly soft. I'm going to bring in, let's try a little bit of this quinacridone gold. Because once spring is this late, things do kind of, the woods sort of warm up a little bit. Anyway, I'm going to keep this soft and watery, like tea, like watery tea. So weak it can't get itself out of the pot. So there's not a lot of pigment. I'm keeping it nice and soft so it stays in the background. If I get too heavy-handed, that's going to make things come forward. So I'm going to keep this in the background. Now there's a little ridge, some shadowing underneath some of these trees. It's a little bit darker. And again, it's just very subtle. So I'm going to make just a few subtle changes while I've got this nice big washy puddle, just to kind of bring in some of that. And it's still very pale and watery, like tea. I'm going to bring that down a little bit through here. And then that comes to where the edge of the field is a little more that gold brown. There's actually a little strip of greenish gold right here, where there's a little bit of green that's trying to pop through, because it is spring after all. And it takes a while to get to Connecticut, but it does eventually come. So I'm going to, let's see, I'm going to move this green next. And I'm going to bring in some of this grassy field. So I'm going to bring in some quinacridone gold, maybe a little bit of this new gamboge, kind of brighten it, but I don't want it Crayola yellow. So I'm going to take a tap of purple. Purple's on the opposite side of the color wheel, so that's going to tone it down a little bit. So I'm just going to go back and forth until I get a color that I think that I like, because this is a very light value. So I do want to keep this light, but there's, you know, a lot of pale color. So when you squint your eyes down and you compare the lightness of that to the dark depths of that, you want to be able to maintain that contrast. So you don't want to get too heavy-handed on this one. I'm going to leave a little bit of gap so they don't touch that gray, because if I touch that gray paint and if it's not dry yet, it's going to swish down into my field. Now, as I'm coming closer, I want to get maybe a little bit heavier in some of the areas, you know, a little bit heavier pigment. So I'm bringing in just a touch more pigment. And again, I can paint right over the tree because this ink is going to stay on top there. And I'm going to come in, there was that one little passage of kind of a dirty green where spring is trying to break through. So I'm going to drop that in while this is still wet. And if you're dropping it in while it's still nice and wet, it's going to travel a bit. Those edges will stay soft. With the soft edges, it makes it recede and go farther in the background. There's some interesting browns going on here, so I'm going to mix up a little bit of a brown. I'm going to use burnt sienna with some little touch of ultramarine just to kind of dirty it up a little bit, and a little more pigment. Throw a touch of that purple in there too. So purple has a little bit of red in it, it's blue and red, so it will keep that brown nice and warm. Rather, if you went too heavy on the blue, it would just kind of get dark on you. So I'm going to bring some of this down here. And then this area in front of the wall has some browns and golds, so I'm just going to lay those in. I'm not going to get too wigged out about where I'm putting them, because it is, a mix of leafy matter on the ground. So we've got most of this background area covered. I think I want to bring this little line a little bit over that way, just to show that this field continues across my page. Now, before I lay in any of this tree stuff, I want to make sure that my surface is dry. If I'm outdoors painting, if you're in bright sunlight, things are going to dry pretty fast. If there's a soft breeze, things are going to dry pretty fast. If there is a lot of moisture in the air, it's going to hold moisture in your paper. So your watercolor will react to your paper the way that whatever the climate is that's going on. So if you're in your house, say painting from photos like we are here, it's the same thing. If the heat's on, if your AC is on, if your climate is dry in your house, it's going to dry your paper quicker. If there's a lot of moisture in your house, say you've got your windows open and it's high humidity, then your paper is going to hold the moisture in your paper, and the paper's going to hold the moisture longer. So you have more open time with your paint, meaning you can go back in and lay in some softer edges. Now, for the sake of video, I'm going to, let's see if I've got this hairdryer. I've got a little hairdryer here in the studio, and I'm going to just hit this with a bit of hairdryer to dry this off. You can't bring a hairdryer plein air, of course. That's what the sun and the wind is for. So here, we're going to make our sun and wind right here. So one of the things that I always like to remind people is when you're testing to see if your paper's dry enough, because sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to tell. It may look dry, you don't see a sheen on it. Use the back of your hand. The backs of your fingers are more temperature sensitive than the pads. I don't know if that's because we've, from cooking, we've kind of burnt off our temperature sensors here, but the backs of your fingers are more temperature sensitive. So lay it down on a place that you know is dry, or that you think is dry. If it feels cool to the touch, it's still damp, so things will still run a little bit. If it feels the same temperature as what you know is dry, then it's dry. So I'm feeling it really cool to the touch in this area because I used a lot of water in that area. So I want to tread carefully when I get down to this, because it's, I might have a little bit of traveling with my paint. So we're going to continue on, and I'm still using the same brush. It's a number 12. This is a brush made by Wonder Forest. It's something I found online, and it's I'm liking it. It's got It holds a nice point. It's all synthetic. It was very inexpensive. In fact, it came with a kit of 5 other sizes, and wonderful. So I'll list that in the supplies as well. So now I'm going to mix some greens, and I want to have some yellow greens, and I'm going to have, I start with my base of sap green, and I never use sap green straight out of the tube because if you did, it would be kind of flat and boring. So I always mix greens because there are so many greens in nature. And if you can even, approach that halfway with your watercolor selection, it'll take you pretty far. So I'm going to start out with this sap green, and I'm going to make a little puddle of it here. I'm going to bring in some New Gamboge on one side, and I'm going to test it here, see if I like it. I might need a little more pigmentation, so a little more paint. It's a little bit on the watery side. So yeah, there we go. So I want this, I don't want to get too heavy-handed because I want to be able to see the ink lines through this. So I'm going to keep this at probably between coffee and milk. And if that sounds weird, and you don't know what I'm talking about with the coffee and milk, I'm going to be posting a video about the secrets of watercolor and how coffee and milk make a difference. And I know that sounds crazy, but you'll see what I'm talking about when you see that video. So I'm going to come down. I start at the top and go down, of course. And in those areas where I've got some darker color, I'm going to bring in some ultramarine blue. And when as I'm mixing, notice how I brought that ultramarine blue on this side. I'm keeping that quinacridone gold on that side, so that in my puddle of sap green, I've got one side that I can push a little more lighter and warmer, and this side I can keep it a little darker and cooler. So while this is still wet, I'm going to bring in this darker paint and let it travel right in there, some of those areas. And it's making a nice contrast with the sky because it's nice and dark. And I'm going to go back to my lighter green. So I'm taking my sap green, which is nice on its own, but I'm mixing in a little bit of this quinacridone gold to give it that more of what I call an evergreen color. There's more of like almost an olive color to it. And I'm going to continue down on that tree. And again, I'm just kind of following these random strokes and trying to follow the shape of this tree. Now, you can see when I come to this part, I want a little bit heavier pigment than what that background is, because this tree has got to sit in front of that background. So you can show that by having more pigment. And that increases that density a little bit. Okay, so I've got a little bit further down. Let's go in and bring in some more of that those nice cool darks. Now, another thing to be mindful of is watercolor dries about 20% lighter than when you lay it down. That's just how all brands are, except there's one brand called Qor, Q-O-R. They're formulated, their binder is, I think it's Aquazol, and it's formulated so that fade shift, that little slight color shift doesn't happen. So I think that's kind of interesting. I've tried a couple of their tubes and I like them. I mean, they're really nice. There's some really good paint manufacturers out there. So I highly encourage you to choose a professional grade paint. I think it will make your paintings have that more luminous quality that watercolor is known for. There's some student grade paints on the market out there that are actually quite chalky. And you know, I'm sure they have their applications somewhere, but if you're frustrated with how your paintings are coming out, consider the fact that it might be the materials that you're using. So you do want to use good paper, which I love cotton paper. I have to admit, it is worth your effort if you're going to put your effort into cotton. And it can be hard to find. And if it doesn't say 100% cotton on that package of paper, then it's made of wood pulp. And so your paper is either made of wood pulp or of cotton. And we could get complicated and say, well, there's also paper made out of flax and linen, but they're pretty hard to find. So again, I'm going to bring in some of those nice darks, and I'm going to keep it probably at the milk level. I don't want to get all the way to cream because that just gets a little too heavy-handed, but keeping it at milk, the milk level of pigment to water ratio, I think that will give us enough contrast against that background and still see our ink lines. Because the ink lines are half of the charm of this thing. I really like those. Let's see, this one is pretty dark. So again, I'm trying to keep my brushwork random and with movement and gusto, kind of like the scribbly lines of the ink marks. I think it just adds a nice touch to it. So look at, just don't stare down at one little branch. Look at the whole thing and see, how does that shape compare? Do I have enough sky holes? Do I have these long bars? Maybe there's a place where some of the, this branch should touch them in the middle somewhere and still leave sky holes. Then as we get down to the base of the tree, this is, let me pull the shadow or the photo up. This is still mostly in shadow. So even though it's lighter here, it's still shadowed by the bulk of this tree. So we're gonna bring in, some burnt sienna, which is way too red and high key. So I'm gonna tone that down with ultramarine blue. This, by the way, burnt sienna and ultramarine blue is my favorite way to mix grays and browns. It just is so versatile. They're both transparent. They both granulate a little bit, sometimes a lot, depending on the brand. And so when they finally dry and settle on your paper, you have a really interesting look. I'm going to bring some of this up through the middle of my paper, where the trunk is. And I don't want it to settle with hard edges. And I'm not going to go making a straight line. I'm going to just hit some of the areas. Because as you can see, you've got some areas where you can see the trunk and some areas where it's just total foliage busting all over. I'm going to bring that down behind this rock wall area. Now, the rock wall, in comparison, is really light. So, and you can see that without squinting, but if you squint down, these rocks are a lot lighter in value than any of the stuff going on in the tree. But there's a lot of fascinating grays in there. So what I would do is to mix my grays. So wonderful grays, what I call lively grays, and not a flat gray out of the tube. A lot of people ask, well, why don't you just use Payne's gray? It's already there in the tube. Because it can be rather flat and boring. So I want to keep my grays lively and exciting. So I'm going to mix them myself. And so you can make a wonderful gray out of your three primary colors, which is red, yellow, and blue. I've got some convenient colors like the sap green, it's already mixed, this mineral violet, which is a really nice purple, And then burnt sienna is a lovely brown. Brown is actually kind of like a dirty grayed down red. So you'll see that if I use this and some of my ultramarine blue, I can even throw in some of this quinacridone yellow for some of those rocks that are in sunshine. Now, what I want to do is I want to add enough water to that so that it makes a really pale tea version. So that's going to be a really nice pale stone color. So, whoops, and I just hit the base of that tree, so it's going to bleed into that rock. But I won't have a panic attack. I'm just going to let it do its thing, and I'll come back later. I'm going to just kind of blot some of that color. And if we need to do it again, we'll do it again. But for now, I'm going to let it just sit there. And I'm going to put an initial wash of this pale color down. And this goes pretty fast. So when you're outdoors, you can keep it pretty fast. I'm not even like worried about the edges on this case. Now what I can do on some of these areas is I can go back with a thirsty brush. A thirsty brush is where you swish out your brush, get the pigment out, and then wipe it dry, and then just go back and hit some of the tops of these, and it will lift off some of this color. You can do what I call a tickle and blot, which is just to take your thirsty brush, and it's easier to see on a darker surface. So if I did a tickle and blot here, I would just tickle the surface. You can actually hear it kind of scratching in almost. And then do a blot with your dry Viva towel. So some of these areas on the rock have, there's some pale areas, and then there's some medium color areas, and there's some dark areas that are in shadow. So we're going to try to emulate that. Again, I'm going to see if they're going to dry first before I get too much color thrown around. And you can see that I'm not really nitpicking over this photo. I'm outside, so I'm working quickly, and yet I still have a painting that's got some nice vibrant color and some semblance of reality. So I'm going to go back to my gray puddle and pull in some more of that ultramarine blue that I had kind of leaked over on that side of the pan. And I'm going to go to my little test swatch and see if I just bring that on some of these rock surfaces, how would that look? So I'm liking that. So here I can just kind of use my photo as a jumping off point. Again, I'm not copying it verbatim. One, because I just think it's just not in my temperament. I would rather stick pins in my eyes than do, high, tight realism. But I do like a very expressive, painterly look. That suits more with my temperament. So you have to determine what is your temperament and what are the ways you like to see things represented, because then that's how you learn to express your nature in your type of painting. If we all painted the same way, it would be kind of a boring world. We don't need 50 more people that paint alike. We need you to paint like you. So I brought in a little bit of darker value. And again, it's not a whole lot darker. It's just a little bit darker. That first value had some quinacridone gold in it. And now this next wash, all I did was pull in a little bit more of ultramarine into that same puddle. And so it's the color, I have this one little square that I usually have a bit of gray going on, and it's mixed out of just what I have on my palette, and no tube grays, no Payne's gray, no neutral tint, none of that stuff. So I just use the colors. I mean, I look at my palette as valuable real estate, and you have to be able to serve me really well to get a spot on my little plot of palette. So for the last pass, once this is a little more dry, I'm just going to fan it with the reference picture because it's nice and big. Because I laid that in fairly wet. If you're outside in the sunshine and you had a little bit of wind, it would dry up pretty quickly. That'll get us there. Now I'm going to bring in some ultramarine, the darker part of that little puddle, and just bring that into some of the bottom areas. So it's not really heavy-handed. I'd say it's between tea and coffee. Because I really want most of my more dense foliage and stuff going on here. I don't want to get too dense with this yet. So I'm going to bring some of these darks into some of these little cracks that I've laid ink in already. I mean, you could leave the ink as it is, or you can bring in some of these, just a touch of this paint. And so some of my areas are wet, so they're going to fuse and kind of run over the edges, and that's okay. If you try to wipe up some of these areas that run, they're going to end up with what I call worry marks. They're just going to look like you were so worried that you were just chasing this running paint. Let the paint run and dry. You'll be surprised because the color is going to soften as it dries. And a lot of times after your paint is dry, you can go back in with another layer. If you go in while it's still wet, things are going to just keep running and shoo, that swish factor that watercolor has. So at this point, let things dry. This could stand on its own as a sketchbook page. I mean, voila, you've got it. You're outside, you've got this lovely tree in the distance. You can sit and analyze it next to your photograph, or if you're outside in real life, and say, okay, what about this needs to change? Do I need to fill in maybe some more dark areas where I can change up some of these sky holes? Remember, random is hard to do, so we can kind of change the randomness of some of these. After some of this dries, the stone wall, I may come back in and give a little more definition to these grasses that I have lightly drawn in, but I wouldn't have to. But I think I will alter some of the greens in the tree. I'm going to go back to my sap green and then pull in some of this ultramarine blue. And I'm going to join some of these little areas that I think are a little more dense. Let's see if we can pull this up a little bit. And again, that will, and I don't want to get too heavy-handed, but I do want to just give a little bit more definition. I think it's attractive when you've got this contrast thing going on. Tree's a little bit backlit, so it's really going to appear darker in areas than what was going on in that far distant area. This, I wish I had left a little more space in. I'm just bringing up some touch of little sprigs. So I don't want to get too fussy and picky with it, but you can kind of drop in a little bit of finesse here and there. Let's deepen some of this area. Deepen some of this coming across. And some of this underneath here. Again, I don't want to block up all my sky holes because they do add a really nice area where you can see the background peeking through. I think that's always an attractive thing to have, those little spaces of contrast and interest. So I think that is enough. So once you kind of get to where you think, okay, that maybe is enough, put your brush down and sit back and look at it. If you're sitting in a chair, prop up your painting, slide back away from it. Give yourself about 3 to 5 feet. It's interesting, when we sit to paint, it's harder to get a true feel for the whole picture as opposed to if you're standing at an easel. So easel painting, you have that chance to walk back and forth and see the big picture. A lot of times when we're working on a sketchbook, we're holding it in our arm and we've got it so close to us. All we're looking at are these little needles on the tree, and we don't step back and see the whole thing. So do take a chance to take the time to put it still and step back and have a look and see this picture that you've just created and see, does it balance? I think, when this dries down here, I'm going to bring in some reeds to give a nice little counterbalance to this. In fact, it's feeling dry enough. Let's see what I can do, and then that will wrap it up. So I'm going to bring in, again, my burnt sienna and a little bit of ultramarine blue, maybe a little bit of purple, because that's got some red. I don't want to get too red. I'm going to test my color out here. And I want to go pretty thin. So I'm going to stay up on the tip of this. So remember, if you stay up, if you've got a brush with a nice point, you can stay up on the tip and get these nice thin lines. And if you want heavier passages, go down on the belly of the brush. So we're going to stay up on the tip, and we're going to just come up and bring some of these little passages. I want some of them below the rock wall, and I want some of them to come up over the top edge. I like that little bit of contrast there. There's some that are going to be behind it. And some that are in front of it. And again, try your best to keep it random. And sometimes random takes practice. It's nice to just practice on a piece of scratch paper, something that, instead of throwing it away, use it to practice brush marks on. This nice little fiddling wispiness, it comes with practice. And so then you know how your brush reacts. And so if it's not coming to you just right off the bat, allow yourself some practice space. So I think that says all I need to say. It's a nice rendition of this space that I was hiking through with this lovely stone wall and this big evergreen. And with social distancing in place as it is right now, if you don't, if you're not able to get outside, maybe you have something out one of your windows or in your backyard, or look across the way to your neighbor's yard, or maybe you've got some photographs from some of your hikes and walks and vacations. Or if you're in one of my classes, I give you a lot of reference material, reference photos that you can use to learn how to make photos feel like plein air rather than rigid, stiff practice. So anyway, I hope that was helpful. Hope you gained some good ideas and some tips and pointers. And if you like this video, subscribe to my YouTube channel and click the like button. And if you're super interested, I'm going to be coming up with some online classes. I have taken my studio classes to an online Zoom format, and so we all love it because we can get together and still continue on with our lessons. So I'm going to be doing that from here until who knows when. And so I'd love for you to join us. Hope you had a great day and get some painting time in. Thanks a lot. Bye.